Hey, we've been doing something a little different with last week and this week. We kind of look at Easter as a two-part series. We start on the Palm Sunday, and we kind of think of it as 8 days of Holy Week. And we really try to tie those two things together. The decorations are kind of done. I don't know if you were here last week, but last week, everything was kind of very similar, but there wasn't the flowers out there. It was a little more like some dead palm branches, and it just kind of looked brownish and deadish. And then this week, it comes alive. It's very really cool how that stuff all kind of plays together. And so one of the things that we've done is we wanted to look at this year and these 2 weeks, and we wanted to look at the last 7 phrases of Jesus. We wanted to see what was the significance of these last 7 things that Jesus says when he's on the cross. And last week, we looked at the first 4. And we each kind of shared some different things that we noticed in those. Like in the first one, where he forgives people. And we recognize, at least internally for me, I recognize that in Jesus' worst moment, he forgave so that in my worst moments, I can forgive others. And from my worst moments, I'm forgiven. And I think that's a really cool thought as each of these phrases kind of catches us. Just like the disciples, you have Matthew, who sees a whole different perspective than John. And then you got Mark and Luke, who have all the other disciples kind of speaking into how they see those last few moments. And they're all speaking into these last moments when Jesus is in the cross, and these last phrases in his last breath, he gives somebody the opportunity to be with him in paradise. He talks to the thief, and then he talks to John and Mary, and he talks to, he even has a reference to God. He quotes scripture, and he says, God, why have you forsaken me? And I think Dwayne did a good job of kind of connecting that with how we forsake God. And we just want to be held. And so then there's this moment that he's looking at Mary and John, and he says to hold to each other, grab onto each other, encourage each other through those difficult moments. And so then we get to the last 3. And that's what we're going to look at today, the last 3 phrases of Jesus. And they're kind of different because in the first ones, he's been speaking to somebody or he's quoting scripture. And even in these, he's kind of quoting some passages. But really, it almost feels like it's between him and God, his Father. And for us, as people looking on, it can feel very impersonal. But what I challenged, what we were talking about, and I was challenged by, is trying to think, how can I take what Jesus says and how does it connect with me personally? Because when Jesus is saying these things, he's saying them out loud, and there's got to be a reason why he says what he says. There's got to be a purpose or a thought behind it, and it's hard for us to describe that or to think about that. But when we dig into them, you begin to see some different things. Like one of them this week is, I thirst. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But leading into that, what happened, there's these 2 moments. These 2 significant moments when Jesus is offered sour wine. The first one is on his way to the cross. And he's offered this sour wine, and it's mixed with, the Roman soldiers would mix it with myrrh. And myrrh was this thing that acted like a sedative that would kind of deaden a little bit of the pain because they wanted to prolong the torture. They didn't want him to faint. They didn't want him to fall down. They didn't want him to be so overwhelmed by the pain that whoever's being crucified could not endure long enough to endure all of it. And so it didn't stop the pain, but it just kind of deadened it enough that it prolonged it. And in this one, he doesn't take a drink. But what was interesting, I thought of, is, wasn't it one of the gifts that he was given by the wise men? They brought myrrh to him. And there's all these oxymorons and these significant moments. The second time when he's offered wine is when he's on the cross. And this is the moment when he says he's thirsty. And that wine, they put it on a sponge, and it was put onto a stick, a hyssop branch, basically, a stick. And that hyssop branch, this is crazy, that hyssop branch is exactly what God told the Israelites to use to dip into the blood and put over their doorposts for the Passover. So think about the significance of what's happening in every single one of these moments. He's saying something, but there's so much more to it. And I think that's why it's so neat to kind of look at these and look at them from a personal perspective. And so that first one is, I thirst. found out in John, and you were kind of thinking some things on that.
Yeah, well, so you mentioned the, the hyssop branch in the myrrh, and those are the things that I immediately started thinking about and reading about and looking into when I started prepping for, this moment right here, right? And I was excited to talk about that stuff because there's so many different ways you can go, and I'm one of those people that I like to know all the inside jokes, right? Like I like to know all the metaphors and the connections and the prophecies, and I like to, make a little cork board with red yarn and stuff all over, and like that's how I like to nerd out, and through that, I've always thought that the more you sort of know about something, the more you care about it, right? And I kind of learned that in my education and stuff, and so that's how I've treated a lot of my faith, and so I was excited. It was like a challenge. Like, where am I going to go with this? You've got the Garden of Gethsemane. The night before, he's talking about, is there any way that this cup can be lifted from me? Right? Well, he's talking about, so there's like this whole thing with Passover cups. And, he's asking if, he doesn't want to do it. He's going to do it. But the next day, he's like, I'm thirsty, right? So he's ready to drink our sin and ready to, consume every ounce of our punishment type of thing, right? Or it could be like the whole idea of the woman at the well with the living water, right? He tells her that he's thirsty, kind of, right? Asks her to give him a drink, so maybe it's that. And he's talking about the living water. That's really the Holy Spirit, isn't it? Right? And so when he's up on the cross, he's saying, I'm thirsty. He's thirsty for that connection with his Father that he doesn't feel right now because he's taken on all the sin and he's cursed by that, right? And it was in one of these conversations that I just kind of jokingly said, or, maybe he was just thirsty, right? And I was like, I'm not going to be able to speak on that. But I started talking into it, and the more I talked into it, I started to get that feeling that I feel when God's about to get onto me a little bit, that he's got something for me. And it was because I'm thinking about, it's making me think about the humanity of Jesus. And when we think about the humanity of Jesus, we're really talking about this paradox. I'm going to nerd out for a second, but stay with me. This paradox of God being fully man and fully God. Or Jesus being fully man and fully God. And this is something that I like to think about, and I do think about it, but I'm doing it from like an intellectual point of view, like almost philosophical, because that's just kind of my standard mode of operation. And at this point, God was telling me, I think you need to look at the humanity of Jesus from a personal point of view, from a human standpoint. Like, put your humanity into this. And so I start thinking about it, and something occurs to me like this. Here's another thing that we always hear. Jesus led a sinless life, right? He never sinned. And that's on his business card, right? Like, that's the whole thing about him, and that's what it was going to take. He had to lead a sinless life in order for us to get grace, and he had to stay perfect right up until the end, until he became sin itself. And the idea of it just seems so automatic that he wouldn't sin. Like, obviously, Jesus is not going to sin. He's the Son of God, right? He's impervious to that. He's got no desire to slip, right? There's no temptation for it. It's not something he's thinking about all the time. But then I started thinking, well, he's fully man too. Is it possible for Jesus to sin? Was it, right? Is that blasphemous to even think that? And the more I thought about it, the more I don't think it is blasphemous. I think it makes it a bigger deal that he didn't. Because now you've got the picture of somebody that's going through their whole life and they're living it on purpose. They're living it in a driven way. And he's making 100,000 decisions, or however many it is you make in a day. And that whole time, he never gets one wrong. He never dishonors his Father. He glorifies him every time. And he's doing it with this man wrapped around him that's feeling the pull of the world that just relax that grip on perfection just for a minute. But he never does. And so it starts to get bigger in my head, like the significance of his life itself. When I started thinking about his death and him saying, I'm thirsty, it's like, let's think about everything before that you've never thought about before, right? And so the way he was able to do it, he tips his hat to the secret. Back at that woman at the well story. The disciples have come back, they've got food. They went into town to get it. They passed the woman on the way, and they say, Jesus, we've brought you food. Do you want some? And he says, I have food to eat that you don't know about. My food is to do the will of he who sent me, to see that his work is finished. So he's saying, like, he hungers, he thirsts for righteousness. He thirsts to accomplish his mission, and his mission involves staying righteous, not sinning, all these things that I mentioned before. That's what he hungers for. He hungers to save us. And he hungers for righteousness. And so it was this hunger, this thirst to stay in communion with his Father that outweighed the weakness of his flesh. But that flesh still had weaknesses. This is the point I'm trying to make. That flesh still got thirsty. It still got hungry. It still got tired. And right now, that flesh is tired and it's hungry. It's exhausted. It's dehydrated. And it's hanging on the cross on Good Friday. And I think that when he said, I'm thirsty, he literally meant it. You better believe he was thirsty. The man was thirsty. And I start thinking about how this is making me feel. And for some reason, it's making me feel really convicted because I've been going through my life minimizing what he accomplished. Not just in his death, but in his life. And not just in his life, but in his death. And everything was so much bigger now that I was considering that he did all of that as a man, that he was relatable, that he completely became us so that he could completely redeem us. And he did it because he was thirsty to do the will of his Father, to do the will of the one who sent him. Who sent me? Am I not called to hunger and thirst for righteousness too? Is it not possible for me to get from one little lily pad in life to the other without messing it up? Can I not draw on that same drive, that same thirst? And so as the life and death of Jesus is getting bigger in my head, my excuses start to really shrink. And the next thing I know, I'm weeping in my office over 2 words, and I start laughing through that because I start thinking, man, this is, or 3 words, I am thirsty. I've been putting an apostrophe in it. That is so classic Jesus, to just take 2 words and make it that big of a thing. And so, yes, he was fulfilling scripture. Yes, he was drawing lines and talking about these symbols, and he was preaching his last sermon and all those things. But if I don't zoom out, I don't ever see myself next to all this. And that's what God wanted me to do. He wanted me to see myself sitting next to the life of Jesus and not be afraid to compare it a little bit. Because I'm capable of doing the will of my Father. And I'm not always going to succeed in that. And that's what God was telling me. He's basically saying, son, you're not always going to get it right, but always try. You know what I mean?
And it's hard. It is so hard to have that desire, to have that hunger, that thirst. Because, and I hate to, this is not a plug, I promise. The But Monday thing. We come here, I come here, I get pumped up, I'm excited, I get to see you guys, I really am excited. Like, you guys don't really realize that I'm excited, but my wife gets this all the time, so she knows. But I'm truly excited to see y'all and excited to spend time with my family of God. Like, you guys are my family. Like, I don't have any family in Dumas. You guys are it. And so to see you guys, to have that to see. It gives me so much joy. And I sat back and I was thinking, and it was a tough thing for me to bring in the perspective of the I am thirsty thing, and to bring in like 3 words, like 3 words, 2 words,
Right.
3 words, you know? And it's one of those things of how in the world can we get anything out of 3 words? And so it blows my mind completely that Jesus was that hungry, that thirsty, that he was human. He was there. How do I get that? How do I get that hunger? Because even as a person that works at the church full time, that hunger sometimes leaves me. And I come to work and I'm like, God, I got to see Matt again. You know, I got to see Adam's fancy beard again. Makes my beard look bad, you know. No, but for real, it's like it's a drag. What'd you say? No.
There's nothing in it, right?
No. You look great. You look great. Grace, which are wisdom. You know, it's without a wisdom in there. No, but no, it's one of those things, man. And I'm trying to understand it. And one of the biggest things I've had to struggle with is my verse. And my verse of understanding what it meant and understanding grace. And I'm telling you, Dwayne, it's grace. Like, yeah, we're forgiven. Everything's good. All is great. Like, what's the big deal? But grace, I struggle and I fight with it to understand how God would forgive me. Like, forgive the misplacement of my hunger and my thirst. And how? Like, why? As Jesus dying on the cross, accomplishing his mission, accomplishing what's going on here, fulfilling every prophecy, fulfilling it all. I'm sitting here struggling as I read, "It is finished." How grace is supposed to, like, I'm just supposed to just be forgiven, like, just like that. It's not fair. It's not fair. And I'm like all about fairness. Like, it's got to be fair. Like, you know, I know Matt always tells me life's not fair, but, you know, for real, like, it's like, no, it's got to be fair with my kids. It's got to be fair. It's just, that's the way it works. It has to be fair. And it's not fair to God that I constantly continue to choose things, my own desires, my own wants, my own things that are in the inside of me. I'm choosing those. And Jesus still constantly says, "Dwayne, it's finished. It's complete." And, you know, all this had to happen, and I get it. It all had to happen, and I don't believe in anything called a coincidence. Like, for me, there's no such thing as coincidence. So, and it's crazy. It's crazy because in the Hebrew language and Aramaic and all that, there is no word for, in God's people, there is no word for coincidence. Because they didn't believe that there was anything called coincidence. Everything happened because it was God's will. And if it's God's will, if this is the desires of God, then this is why it's happening. And to think of it that way, to think, man, there's no such thing as coincidence. All this is happening during the Passover. And as Matt mentioned with the hyssop plant. And so back when Moses, oh, get me all excited now. But Moses is up there and he's telling his people and he's trying to, he's like, listen, look, this is what you need to do. You are going to bring a lamb into slaughter. He's telling us this is the way you are going to be forgiven. This is the way that death is going to pass you by. You kill this lamb, you grab the hyssop plant, you put blood on the hyssop plant, you put it over your door. And when you put it over your door, death will pass, judgment will pass. And when that happens, we Moses is telling his people, we are going to leave. We are going to be forgiven. We are going to leave this place. We will not be tied down any further. Released from our shackles. And that is what bringing this lamb into slaughter, this perfect, unblemished, unbroken bones, everything perfect lamb, bringing this into slaughter is going to forgive and get us out of this hole. And again, no such thing as coincidence. As God brings his lamb to the slaughter. And as we know, beaten, spit on, and now hanging on a cross, dying for every single one of us, dying for me, so that I can receive grace. And he says those words. It is finished. I'm not done, man. Settle down. So I wrote this down because I want to make sure it's said like this. It says, so Jesus comes as God's own lamb without blemish or broken bone in the perfection of his obedience. At Calvary, in the presence of the hyssop plant, he freely offers the one full, perfect, and sufficient sacrifice, I can't even say the word, oblation and satisfaction for the sins of the world. And this is like something, hey, this should bring a smile to your face. This should bring joy. It almost kind of frustrates me a little bit that you're not shouting in joy, because this is exactly what Jesus did so that we would be able to receive the grace. And I'm going to keep going. It says, as Jesus cries, it is finished. He gives himself up for death. The knife falls, and all the ages' sacrifices are gathered and rendered obsolete forever. Every sacrifice that was given before Jesus is obsolete. It's gone. It doesn't matter. It doesn't even, there's no point. Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. And because he has died, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, for all who have come and trusted in the virtue of sacrifice, there is no longer any sacrifice for sin, because he is the one, he's the sacrifice. That is why we all gathered here today. That is why. And still, I sit back and I think, I still don't deserve his grace. I don't deserve his forgiveness. And I'm supposed to walk in fullness of his grace. I don't understand it. I don't understand the fact how I have to continuously leave church, leave everything I'm doing, and I fall into sin, and I fall, and I fall, and I fall. And I fall. And the only way I've been able to come up to any understanding of any of this is God says, Dwayne, you're right. You suck. You are horrible. You cannot be in my presence. You are not holy. You are a sinner. You cannot be here. And Jesus dying on the cross, as he looks up at his Father and says, Father, it is finished. His blood is washed over me. I am not a sinner, but a saint. Forgiven. I am forgiven.
Yeah. Rest in that for a second. Think about where we've come from. In just 6 words. The living water who said, if you believe in me, you'll never thirst again, says, I'm thirsty. God, Jesus, says it is finished. But it's not finished yet. He hasn't risen from the dead. He hasn't died yet. And it brings us to this last phrase. where he says, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. Or some versions say, I give up my spirit. And that idea of giving up kind of captured me for a moment. Because I had to think about what Jesus meant by that. I mean, it's a weird phrase. I hope I come up with something better the day that I die. Because that's a weird one. But at the same time, there's something to it. You see, Jesus is God. He's God in the flesh. He's always been and he always will be. He's the Alpha, the Omega. He's the beginning and the end. He was never born, never created, because he is the creator and he's never going to die. And yet in a moment, he has to give up his spirit. He has to. Because he's God and he can't die, but he's got to die. And so there's all this that I'm wrestling with, and I was thinking about that idea of giving up. And if you don't know me too well, my wife knows me pretty well. I don't give up easily. Most of the time, when we're in an argument or we disagree on something, I just remind her that when we get to heaven, she'll realize that I'm right. Because I don't give up. It's something built in me that I don't give up. And this last week, we were taking one of my girls to Colorado, and I was kind of thinking about this as I'm driving home. That there's a good part of never giving up, but it can also become a weakness where my pride gets in the way. And I want to hold on. I still do this in so many things, but I want to hold on because I want control. And I don't want to give up. And so this pride sets in. And I don't want to, I'll be honest, I don't want to see, we're getting ready to take our youngest to North Carolina. I don't want to take her to North Carolina. That's too far away. I want to hold on. I don't want to give up. And sometimes that puts me in really bad situations where I've got to figure out how to get out of it because I think I have it. And in this moment, Jesus gives up. Why? Because if he hadn't given up, we would not know how to give up. We wouldn't know how to give over our lives to Christ. As Freddie was getting baptized, as I was getting ready to baptize him, I thought about doing this, Freddie, but I didn't do it long. I don't know where you're at, but you realize when people get baptized, it's a picture of Jesus' death and resurrection, but there's this moment when you go down where you are completely entrusting the person holding you to bring you back up. And I remember my dad threatening to hold me down a little longer when he baptized me. And I've done that with a few people here and there. And I thought, there's this moment when you go down. Some people have really bothered me. No, just kidding. It's mostly people that I know. So you go down, and then you've got to completely trust that person to help you back up. Otherwise, you're going to be sucking in water. There are all these moments that we have to give up. And so maybe this morning, as you're thinking about these last few phrases of Jesus, you have been sitting there and you just want to experience the forgiveness of God. He's already forgiven you. Forgive them. They don't understand what they're doing. There's this part of you that just wants to be with him in paradise, but you know that's what's gotten in the way is your sin. And every time you sin, you have forsaken God. You have turned your back on him. And he is there, and and in this moment, he's on the cross, and he's like, no, I've got you. I'm here to hold you. And yeah, there's going to be moments when you thirst and you hunger for righteousness. There are going to be other moments when you thirst and hunger for not righteousness. Just know it's finished. I've paid the price. And maybe it's just time to give up. Maybe this morning, for the first time, you realize it's time to give up what you've been holding on to for so long because it is finished. The last 7 words of Jesus are amazing. They are impersonal, they're oxymorons, they're paradoxical, they're a whole lot of things, but they're deeply personal for you and I. And so we hope this Easter season that you have experienced his forgiveness and his love, and we hope that you know that it is finished. It's time to just give up. Because while we may not totally understand what grace is, and it's good luck, the reality is he has given us amazing grace.